The idea of the ideal. Every fact, truth and precept, every concept or formulation, or communication, is an idea. Some ideas are murky, confused, obtuse, ill-formed, and some are even incomprehensible. Ideas can contradict themselves, because they convey two incompatible views at the same time. Other ideas are powerful and lead to surprising and previously unconsidered positions. When we talk about reality or God or metaphysics, we are discussing ideas with associated ideas. Reality is a complex idea because it is composed of component ideas. We say reality is composed of matter, energy, space and time. What are these but ideas? To think about reality is to think about its implications. Reality is not a thing so much as a door to every other idea. Every idea needs a definition, if it is to be comprehended. Mankind, as a thing, is an idea. As an idea, mankind has many other ideas associated with it. The associated ideas of mankind give us a definition of what we think the word means. Some of us look at the word as an expression of the patriarchal denigration of, or the dismissiveness of men towards, women. Others see it as a comprehensive inclusion of many forms of life that include, what others might think of as, the lower primates. No word has a natural definition. Every word is artificial and every definition an expression of a complex idea. The definition we use to define an idea does, however, seek to encapsulate all that the word conveys, in a comprehensive and concise way. Words have an ideal form, but it is not always possible to put this image into words. We often know what we mean, even when we cannot express it. However, the breadth of our vocabulary and the facility with which we can apply the rules of grammar, it makes us more intelligent and interesting than those limited to a few thousand words. However, a child can make do with a few hundred words because of the paucity of its ideas. Complex ideas need complex concepts to communicate the ideas. We cannot talk about physics without a large, specialized vocabulary. The more arcane the idea, the more neologisms that must be developed and incorporated into one's vocabulary. There is a logical development of ideas reflected in the logical development of language. New words must be defined by old. The new idea cannot be totally divorced from previous ideas, as the new word has to be an extension of words already in use. There is then a logical progression of ideas behind the logical progression of science and technology. Physicists talk about the beginning of the universe. There is also a beginning of logos, or the original word or idea, the precept that gives rise to words and therefore to intelligence. What is intelligence but the ability to communicate? If we do not have words tied to ideas, we cannot communicate. But from whence comes the original word? How can there be a sentient being without the ability to communicate? We are aware because we are aware of ideas. This connection between sentience and conceptualization might appear to be a philosophical problem akin to the question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But in fact, it is a question that impacts civilization, depending on how we answer it. We claim man is rational. But in saying this, we are thinking of man in the singular. We attribute reason to the individual soul. But this is not a tenable idea. Sentience is not an attribute of individuals, but of groups. Some groups of black people can and do score worse on intelligence tests than Asians, because they do not possess a culture that leads to a high level of sentience. It's a group or cultural problem, not something to be repaired on the level of the individual. Taken out of their culture and brought up in a society in which there is no knowledge of Africa, the black person would be as the host culture is. But so long as they hate whites and anything associated with whites, they will align with anything alien to white culture. This impacts them in a seriously negative way. However, this same condemnation can be laid at the feet of secular culture. Secularists are not sentient to the same degree as Christians and Jews. Anti-white liberals suffer from the same negative effects as do black in America, though not to the same degree, as their rejection of Western culture is not as dramatic. This is why, despite the assertions made by secularists, that Christians are anti-science, it is Christians and Jews who dominate science. The seat of sentience is truth, and truth are encapsulated in the church. When society breaks down, when we become isolated, our sentience and intelligence drop. We are devoid of all human contact, we cannot aspire to be human. Without human contact, the idea of humanity is missing. Without a male role model, we do not know what it is like to be man, nor do females understand what is required to engage with men. The sentience of animals is not sufficient to bring humans into the human realm, we need human contact to learn what it means to be a sentient being. The reverse is also true. Men treat women as they learn to treat them, from engaging with their mother and sisters. The broken family is a disaster for the future of the race, but the small family, especially the single-child family, is insufficient to fully socialize the child. This is why the shutting of the schools during COVID was a disaster for children, especially those in a single-parent, single-child family. When we talk about the family, we have to have an image of what a family means. If we think of a family as two men with a dog, we are on a different plane of existence than those who hear the word family and visualize a man and woman and 3 children. If we attempt to include every sort of relationship within the word rapidly loses meaning. We have a concept of what a relationship means. It is inclusive. If marriage becomes synonymous with relationship, then it has no application. The modern view of marriage simply means a personal relationship. Why conflate the ability to have a relationship with other human beings, with marriage? If reality is all those things composed of matter, energy, space and time, what do we do about the human world? Just because we can measure space and time with precision, does not make them more real than love. Which brings us to the topic of the substance of reality, which is not the real question. There are 2 options, and each give us a totally different kind of reality. The question is, what reality do we subscribe to? The reality we believe in will tell us what the substance of reality is. Physical reality, needless to say, gives us a reality composed of matter, energy, space and time. It is the conventional universe and the one we think is accessible by the 5 senses. This is also known as the phenomenological universe, because it is composed of perceivable phenomenon. This reality is as real as our perceptions are identical with the thing that gives rise to the perception. There is supposed to be a correlation between fact and between perception and actuality. But there is no way to test or verify this correlation. That is, we cannot determine how close our perception comes to the stimulus. There is no physical correlate for blue or hardness. Even when we think things are real, the reality we experience is totally mental. The supposition is that without a brain, we cannot experience anything. So, how real is this experience that is in the brain? Empirical experiments test propositions, but only in terms of some type of quantification. We can test to see how many carrots weigh over 10 ounces, after 10 weeks, and how many under. We cannot devise an experiment to test whether what I think a carrot looks like, is the same as what you think one looks like. A pound is defined by a system of measurement that is artificial. There is no possible way to prove a pound weighs a pound because it's a contrived data point. It's like saying a yard is the distance between the end of the fingers and the shoulder. It's a totally arbitrary and artificial artifice, but it gives us a standard way to measure yard goods, all the same. The point is, we perfected what the yard measure is, but it is still an artifice, not real. The yard measure was no longer dependent on the vagaries of the human skeleton. The yard became a unit of measure defined by law, backed up by precise instruction on establishing what the yard measure is. The range in variance between a yard length, measured by different people, is extremely low because the unit is precisely defined. Which brings us to the idea of the ideal? This is where we question what the ideal is, that we need to do to be perfect. This is an easy question to answer, as there can only be one ideal. There cannot be competing ideals, or they are not ideals. Only one conception of the ideal is possible. We call the ideal God. Even if you do not believe in God, you cannot conceive of any ideal that is not God. Rejecting the existence of God is rejecting the possibility of an ideal. God equals 1. The highest and most perfect of all possible conceptions of the ideal. 2. The concept beyond which nothing can be considered more perfect, or closer to the idea of the ideal. 3. The standard beyond which no other standard exists that is higher. 4. The standard conceptions are judged. If a greater or more perfect standard of truth can be conceived, what is conceived as the more perfect ideal, is God, and that which we deem to be less than ideal, or imperfect is not God. If greater can be conceived, then what is being considered as lower than God? From the Ideal Dictionary. The relative and the material cannot be the ideal. Such a state is alien to what they are. A material structure is never an ideal structure. Modifications can always be made. This is the basic conclusion established by Plato. Even in science, the truth is never settled, and new findings are always assumed to be possible. No one reaches an ideal state through conducting a scientific experiment. Therefore, the idea of the ideal is alien to the modern mind steeped in the scientific method. We have been inculcated into the doctrine of mediocrity and the cult of the average. Rare is the person who seeks exceptionalism. When they do not seek perfection of an idea, they do not seek perfection in themselves, and they no longer strive to find God. We are a people who no longer believe in God because we no longer believe in ourselves. Unfortunately, people have no idea about the repercussions of denying God. Without an ideal, there is nothing to compare an idea to. Every idea is considered on its own merits, on an ad hoc basis. Murder is even on the table, if the situation seems to warrant it. The idea of murder is just as reasonable as a cola drink, if there is no ideal against which to evaluate it. The ideal is something we aspire to, otherwise we are without direction. If there is no God, then technically everything is on the table, and only comes off the table if the conditions seem to warrant it, at that time. If God exists, then we no longer look at options through the lens of a sovereign individual. If we believe in the ideal, then everything must be compared against this, as the standard against which all things are to be compared. If God exists, then it is natural to know Him as the ideal, and if there is an ideal, it is even more natural to strive to replicate the ideal. We, as an idea, strive to realize the ideal, that is God. This is how we strive for perfection. Because God is necessarily the highest possible conception of things, the ideas we have are justified by their relationship to truth, and justice must align with God. If our idea of truth conflicts with the ideal of God, then one or the other has been corrupted. This kind of comparison can be made even when it comes to the kind of work we do. If our job conflicts with the ideal of God or is incapable of being perfected by us as we align with God, there is something wrong with our job. If we conflict with the ideal, there is something wrong with us. The ideal, because of its nature, cannot be wrong or faulted, therefore the fault must always be with the idea.